On your table, there has always been a deeply controversial white crystalline powder. Just a small pinch can turn even the thinnest, blandest broth into something intensely savory. In Japan, it was once held as the hope of revolutionizing the dinner table. In China, it became a weapon in a national commercial counterattack against Japanese dominance. America, meanwhile, became wildly dependent on it, pouring it into canned foods and military rations while also putting it on trial in the courts of science and morality. Even more ironically, when frightened Chinese consumers threw away MSG and replaced it with chicken bouillon powder marketed as natural and healthy, they had simply fallen for a carefully engineered act of commercial sleight of hand. So how did an ordinary seasoning over the course of a single century become entangled in a commercial war between China and Japan, then the Pacific War, and eventually become the center of half a century of racial prejudice and media panic? Today, we are going to uncover the century-old story the world has kept hidden. Tokyo, 1908. One evening, Kikunai Ikeda lifted a bowl of soup prepared by his wife. He took a sip and tasted something unusually savory. It was not salty, it was not sour, and it was not sweet. "What did you put in this?" he asked. "Just some kombu," his wife replied. Ikeda was puzzled. Kombu was nothing more than dry seaweed. So why did it produce such a powerful, savory taste? Ikeda was a chemistry professor at Tokyo Imperial University. Several years earlier, he had studied in Germany. There, he had watched chemists break food down into proteins, fats, and other components. He had also seen modern industry turn laboratory discoveries into products ordinary people could buy. After returning to Japan, one question stayed with him. Was there a way to make cheap, bland food taste genuinely satisfying? This bowl of soup seemed to spark an idea, so Ikeda took kombu into his laboratory. After repeated experiments, he finally isolated a small amount of white crystals, glutamic acid. But the crystals tasted slightly sour and did not dissolve easily in water. They were not yet suitable as a seasoning. So he reacted the glutamic acid with sodium bicarbonate. The result was a compound called monosodium glutamate. Ikeda tasted a little. There, it was the same captivating savoriness he had tasted in the soup. At the time, however, no one yet understood umami as a distinct taste. It was not until the 21st century, nearly 100 years later, that scientists confirmed the existence of taste receptors specifically involved in sensing umami. These receptors do not respond to sweetness, sourness, bitterness, or saltiness. But when they encounter glutamate, they are immediately activated and send a pleasurable signal to the brain. In July 1908, Ikeda patented his method for producing monosodium glutamate. By conventional standards, a scientist's job would have been done, but Ikeda wanted to accomplish something much bigger. So he approached Saburosuke Suzuki, a businessman who dealt in iodine and chemical products. After tasting soup seasoned with monosodium glutamate, Suzuki immediately understood. Ikeda had not invented a new ingredient, he had isolated a flavor. Traditionally, that savoriness had to be extracted slowly from kombu, dry fish, or meat. Now, just a tiny amount of these white crystals could recreate the flavor traditionally drawn out by slowly simmering kombu, dried fish, or meat. The two men began planning a factory to manufacture the crystals on a large scale. To make mass production possible, they abandoned the idea of boiling enormous quantities of kombu. Instead, they used wheat protein as their main raw material and extracted the glutamic acid through acid hydrolysis. For retail sale, the white crystals were placed in glass bottles and given a branded label. They gave the product a name rich with meaning, Ajinomoto. The name meant the essence of taste. In May 1909, Ajinomoto officially went on sale. At first, the expensive bottle of unfamiliar white crystals sat untouched on store shelves. Ikeda and Suzuki soon realized that their greatest obstacle was not simply the marketplace. It was a culinary tradition the Japanese had protected for more than 1,000 years. The crystals had no familiar color and no tempting aroma. Only after adding them to food could anyone understand what they actually did. 6 days after Ajinomoto was launched, its first advertisements appeared in newspapers. Promotional teams also took to the streets of Tokyo, waving banners and loudly advertising the new product. Some even shouted, "With Ajinomoto, you will never need kombu or dried bonito again." They had barely finished the sentence before traditional dashi makers and food craftsmen came storming out in anger. They fiercely opposed the strange white crystals. To them, dashi was the soul of Japanese cooking, a flavor built through time, discipline, and generations of craftsmanship. And now, a factory-made white crystal was claiming it could replace traditional kombu and dried bonito. To these craftsmen, it was an insult to everything their tradition represented. The backlash taught Suzuki an important lesson. If people were going to accept Ajinomoto, he could not tell them to abandon traditional ingredients. He had to convince them that the new seasoning would make those ingredients taste even better. Ajinomoto began organizing tastings and cooking demonstrations, teaching consumers when to add seasoning and how much to use. In that era, people were often curious about something new that they did not yet understand. How could such a tiny amount transform an entire pot of soup? Where did it come from? And what exactly happened inside the factory? Less than 10 years after Ajinomoto was launched, a frightening rumor began spreading through Japan. Ajinomoto was made from snakes. No one knew where the rumor had started. No one produced any evidence. But that did not stop it from traveling from one household to the next. Ajinomoto immediately responded in the newspaper. The product was not made from snakes. Its main raw material was wheat. But a written denial could not erase the fear. Rumors require no proof. Facts, however, often have to be seen. So Ajinomoto opened the doors of its factory. Visitors were shown how wheat was broken down, filtered, and crystallized before the finished seasoning was placed into bottles. The rumor did not destroy Ajinomoto. Instead, more and more people began to accept it. And before long, the seasoning moved beyond Japan. By 1918, Ajinomoto could be found in Shanghai stores, restaurants, and newspaper advertisements. Japanese businessmen began calculating how much money they could make from China's enormous market, even raising their glasses in celebration. But a threat capable of destroying their monopoly was already taking shape. Wu Yunchu, a native of Jiading in Jiangsu, was an expert in industrial chemistry. While everyone else carried Ajinomoto into the kitchen, Wu carried it into the laboratory. His goal was simple: produce the same substance in China and break Japan's monopoly. In 1921, his experiments finally produced a breakthrough. He successfully extracted the same white crystals. He gave the product a Chinese name, Wei Jing, literally the essence of seasoning. But turning laboratory crystals into a commercial product presented two serious problems. Wu had no money to build a factory and no distribution network to sell the product. A chemist with technical knowledge alone could not build a business of this scale. Through an introduction, Wu met Zhang Yiyun, Shanghai's soy sauce king. He had substantial capital and a sales network stretching across the city. Wu brought the technology. Zhang brought the money and the distribution. The partnership made immediate sense. In 1923, they established China's first domestic MSG factory, the Tianqiu MSG factory. But Ajinomoto already dominated the market. Even Zhang's network of soy sauce shops was nowhere near enough to challenge the Japanese giant. Tianchu needed a way to break through. They began with branding. Ajinomoto used the image of a woman holding a seasoning bottle and was popularly known as the beauty brand. Tianchu chose the Buddha's hand emblem. Buddhist imagery was deeply familiar in China. The symbol suggested blessing and good fortune. It also appealed to China's large vegetarian community, making the brand feel more familiar and trustworthy. But clever packaging alone could not bring down Japan's commercial empire. What truly transformed the market was a sudden political storm. In 1925, the May 30th movement erupted in Shanghai, triggering a nationwide wave of boycotts against Japanese goods. Tianchu quickly recognized the opportunity. The company lowered its prices and promoted the product as 100% Chinese-made. Consumers were no longer choosing between two bottles of seasoning. They were choosing between two different sites. Driven by the boycott movement, sales of Tianchu's MSG surged. The young factory became a symbol of China's growing national industry. Wu later secured manufacturing patents in Britain, France, the United States, and other countries. By ordinary business logic, Wu could have protected the process and collected the licensing fees from anyone who wanted to use it. Instead, he made an extraordinary decision. He made the manufacturing formula available to producers across China without charging any licensing fees. Wu understood that Tianchu alone could not win a prolonged battle against Ajinomoto. To break the Japanese monopoly, he needed more Chinese factories in the fight. By 1928, after the patent was opened to Chinese manufacturers, more than a dozen Chinese MSG factories had entered the market. Not only did Tianchu avoid losing business, it made a fortune supplying key materials and equipment to the new factories. Domestic MSG flooded the market, and the price war Ajinomoto had once prided itself on collapsed almost overnight. Just as Ajinomoto was being driven into retreat, the wheel of fate turned once again. In 1937, Japan launched its full-scale invasion of China, and Shanghai came under bombardment. A commercial battle once fought on store shelves and in newspaper advertisements was dragged into a real and devastating war. 8 years of war completely reshaped Asia's MSG industry. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, MSG was quietly invading the United States in a completely different way. As early as 1917, Ajinomoto had established a sales office in New York. Its Japanese promoters hoped American households would keep a bottle of Ajinomoto in the kitchen, just as Japanese households did. American consumers were not interested. American regulators even classified it as a vegetable protein derivative, a label that made it sound more like an industrial ingredient than something meant for the dinner table. Then, in 1931, the New York office received a major order. The buyer was not an American household. It was the food giant Heinz. Campbell's and other canned food companies soon followed. Canned soup had to survive high-temperature processing and long periods in storage. Its original flavor could easily become flat and thin. A small amount of MSG could restore depth and savoriness while making every batch taste more consistent. Food manufacturers immediately saw its value. A strange contradiction appeared. While ordinary Americans were still wondering whether they should buy a bottle of Ajinomoto, American food factories were already buying it by the case and adding it to canned soups and a growing range of processed foods. On the surface, ordinary consumers were not buying it directly, but as processed food spread across the country, they were indirectly eating it every day. That dependence was suddenly disrupted in 1941 when the Pacific War cut off supplies from Japan. But the demand did not disappear. Canned food still had to be produced, and military rations still had to reach the front lines. American companies began building their own MSG production lines. General Mills added MSG to one of its new production divisions. International Minerals and Chemical went even further. directly acquiring an amino acid factory to mass produce MSG specifically for US Army rations. At the time, a dramatic story even circulated in full science circles. American soldiers in the Pacific were said to be willing to throw away their Coca-Cola just to seize Japanese military rations because they had discovered a mysterious, addictive, savory flavor in the enemy's food. Perhaps it was only a legend, or perhaps it really happened. Those who know more are welcome to join the discussion. After the war, industrial demand for MSG exploded. But MSG still had to be extracted from wheat or soy protein through hydrolysis. The process was complicated and expensive, and the production could not expand fast enough. Unless that cost barrier could be broken, MSG would remain a luxury reserved for only a handful of industry giants and large, advanced factories. The entire food industry was anxiously waiting for an answer, waiting for a revolution. The year was 1956 at the Kyowa Hakko Research Institute in Tokyo. Researchers were searching for a bacterium no one had ever identified before. Their reasoning was simple. When yeast consumes sugar during brewing, it produces alcohol. Could there also be a microorganism that consumed sugar and produced glutamic acid? They began testing the idea in the laboratory. A few days later, they found exactly such a bacterium, one that consumed the sugar and released the glutamic acid. It was an extraordinary discovery. News of the discovery soon reached the University of Tokyo, where a Taiwanese researcher named Su Yuanzhi was conducting similar experiments. Su isolated a new bacterial strain. Its behavior resembled the Japanese strain 534, feed it sugar, and it would continuously release glutamic acid. At the time, Taiwan had no shortage of sugar. It was a major sugarcane producing region filled with sugar mills. But turning a bacterium in a test tube into a factory capable of operating on a 10,000-ton scale required a businessman willing to gamble. That businessman was Huang Liehuo, the founder of Weichuan. At the time, Weichuan was not yet a major food company. It was a young local manufacturer struggling against the powerful Japanese competitors. Determined to turn the company around, Huang staked its future on the new technology. Working with Su Yuanzhi, he invested in building Asia's first large-scale industrial fermentation tank. By 1959, Weichuan had begun producing fermented MSG on a large scale. MSG completely turned Weichuan's fortunes around and helped it grow into the food giant it is today. The old, expensive hydrolysis process was now being overturned. All it took was cheap waste molasses and a bacterium invisible to the naked eye to keep churning out white crystals. The results were dramatic. Costs collapsed and production soared. It seemed that a new age of cheap, mass-produced umami had only just begun. Then, an ordinary-looking letter quietly tipped over the first domino. On the 4th of April 1968, the New England Journal of Medicine published a reader's letter. The author was a physician named Robert Holman Kwok. He wrote that whenever he ate at a Chinese restaurant in the United States, he felt numbness at the back of his neck, spreading into his arms and back, followed by weakness and a rapid heartbeat. Strangely, he never experienced the same symptoms after eating Chinese food at home. What was causing the reaction? Kwok himself did not know. As a careful physician, he did not identify a culprit. Yet, the inconclusive letter appeared under an unforgettable title, Chinese Restaurant Syndrome. A little more than a month later, the journal published 10 related letters. Some writers reported headaches. Others described tightness in the chest. The symptoms were not even consistent. But once they were grouped under the name Chinese Restaurant Syndrome, almost any discomfort after a meal could be blamed on Chinese food. If the letters created suspicion, an experiment 1 year later allowed that fear to put on a lab coat. In 1969, American neuroscientist John Olney published the animal study. The conditions were clearly stated in the paper. The subjects were developing newborn mice, and they received extremely high doses through subcutaneous injection. But once the experiment left the scientific paper and entered newspapers and the public debate, those crucial conditions disappeared. Newborn mice became human beings. High-dose injection became ordinary consumption. In the end, the entire study was reduced to one terrifying claim that was also incredibly easy to spread. MSG is toxic. It damages the brain. Panic erupted. Parents began asking the same frightening question. Could this ingredient damage their children's brains? The food giants moved first. Heinz, Gerber, and other major companies quickly announced that they would stop using MSG in baby food altogether. But the food industry did not give up on umami. Instead of adding MSG directly, manufacturers could use ingredients such as hydrolyzed vegetable protein and yeast extract. These ingredients are not MSG, but they still contain free glutamate and can provide the same kind of savory depth. Large manufacturers could change their formulas and keep umami in canned foods and snacks. They had a way to step away from the controversy. Chinese restaurants had nowhere to hide. Customers began walking in and immediately asking, "Do you put MSG in your food?" Restaurant owners could not explain scientific papers to every customer who entered. They needed a simpler answer. Soon, the same two words began appearing on the windows and menus of one Chinese restaurant after another. No MSG. It was no longer simply an ingredient claim. It was a public declaration of innocence. Food giants escaped through a game of words and labels. Chinese restaurants, meanwhile, became the only victims burned at the stake in this wave of public panic. The story now moves to the 1980s. Nearly 20 years had passed since Kwok's original letter. Scientists returned to the case and began re-examining the evidence. In 1987, experts working with the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Health Organization re-evaluated MSG. Their conclusion was clear. Under normal conditions of use, there was no need to assign MSG a specific acceptable daily intake. In the 1990s, the US Food and Drug Administration reviewed the evidence again. The scientific evidence did not support the claim that ordinary MSG consumption damaged the brain. Only a very small number of people might experience short-lived discomfort after consuming an extremely large dose on an empty stomach. But while the West remained deeply suspicious of MSG, rumors that MSG, or Weijing as it is called in Chinese, caused cancer or hair loss also spread through China. Consumers began fearing the same white chemical crystals. When an old empire collapses, new capital often feasts on the ruins. Manufacturers of chicken bouillon powder quickly recognized the gap in the market. They never attacked MSG directly. Instead, they kept drilling one idea into the public mind. Chicken bouillon comes from real chicken. It is natural and nourishing. In 1999, seeing the opportunity in this umami revolution, Swiss food giant Nestlé spent heavily to acquire an 80% stake in Chinese chicken bouillon giant Totole, bringing this commercial game to its climax. Soon, primetime television was saturated with advertisements featuring golden hens, while supermarkets placed chicken bouillon in their most valuable shelf space. Then, hundreds of millions of households put away their bottles of MSG and replaced them with packages bearing the image of a hen. But turn the package over and read the ingredients. The flavor-enhancing ingredient present in the greatest amount is still monosodium glutamate. East or West, people often respond to fear, and uncertainty in remarkably similar ways. In the United States, a cheap no MSG sign could buy a customer's peace of mind. In China, a housewife could soothe her anxiety about health simply by replacing MSG with a package printed with a golden hen. Businesses use the wordplay to change the name. People use the self-reassurance to calm their fears. Today, these white crystals are still everywhere. The world has never stopped craving the savoriness they provide. We never truly rejected monosodium glutamate itself. What we rejected were the names MSG and Weijing, the Chinese name for it, two names contaminated by half a century of prejudice and fear. That is the absurdity of history. Once prejudice takes root, even the truth may need generations to erase it. Science acquitted MSG long ago, but the Declaration of Innocence hanging in Chinese restaurant windows has still not been fully taken down.